My family blew through my settlement money without asking, but when they needed help again, what I sent them back left them silent. I'm 29, and until 18 months ago, I thought family meant people who had your back no matter what. I learned the hard way that for some people, family just means having first access to whatever you've got that they want. My name is Connor, and this is the story of how I discovered that my own blood relatives saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM. Let me start with how I ended up with money in the first place. 3 years ago, I was working as a delivery driver for a local logistics company, just trying to make ends meet while I figured out my next move. I dropped out of college after my second year when my dad lost his job and I needed to help with bills. The plan was always to go back eventually, but life has a way of derailing plans. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was making a routine delivery to a downtown office building when a distracted driver ran a red light and T-boned my delivery truck. The impact was so severe that it took the fire department 40 minutes to cut me out of the wreckage. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital with a shattered pelvis, 3 broken ribs, and internal injuries that required 2 surgeries to repair. The other driver was texting while driving, had a history of traffic violations, and was driving a company vehicle at the time. My lawyer said it was one of the most clear-cut liability cases he'd ever seen. After 18 months of legal proceedings, depositions, and medical evaluations, I received a settlement of $347,000 after legal fees and medical expenses. Now let me tell you about my family. My parents, Harold and Diane, have always been the type of people who live paycheck to paycheck despite making decent money. Dad works in construction and Mom is a school secretary, but they've never been good with money. Every windfall gets spent immediately on things they deserve, rather than saved for emergencies. My younger sister Emma is 26 and has inherited their spending habits along with an extra dose of entitlement. She's the type who thinks the world owes her something just for existing. She's bounced between jobs and relationships her whole adult life, always finding someone else to blame when things don't work out. My parents enable her behavior by constantly bailing her out financially. My older brother Vincent is 32 and probably the most responsible of my siblings, but he's got this martyr complex where he thinks he needs to solve everyone's problems. He's married to Rachel and they have 2 young kids. Vincent works as a mechanic and Rachel is a nurse, so they do okay financially, but they're always stretched thin because Vincent can't say no when family asks for help. When I first got the settlement money, I was overwhelmed. I'd never had more than a few $100s in my bank account at one time, and suddenly I had a life-changing amount of money. I knew I needed to be smart about it. The accident had left me with some ongoing back issues that might require future medical treatment, and I'd lost almost 2 years of earning potential during recovery and legal proceedings. I decided to put most of the money into a high-yield savings account and some conservative investments. I used about $40,000 to pay off my student loans and credit card debt, and another $15,000 to buy a reliable used car since my old one had been totaled in the accident. The rest was going to be my safety net while I figured out my next career move and dealt with any ongoing medical issues. My family knew about the settlement, of course. I'd been living with my parents during most of my recovery, and they'd been involved in the legal process as my emergency contacts. At first, everyone seemed genuinely happy for me. Mom cried when I told her I could finally pay off my debts, and Dad kept saying how proud he was that I was being smart with the money. But things started changing pretty quickly. It began with small comments and suggestions. Emma mentioned that she was behind on her rent and joked about me being her rich brother now. Dad started talking about how the house needed a new roof and wouldn't it be nice if the family could all chip in to help each other out. Mom would make comments about how lucky I was to not have to worry about money anymore while she stressed about their mortgage payment. Vincent was the only one who didn't ask for anything directly, but I could see the stress he was under trying to keep everyone else afloat. He'd been lending money to Emma regularly, and I knew my parents had borrowed from him more than once when their spending got out of control. I tried to set boundaries early on. I explained that the money had to last me potentially for the rest of my life if my back problems got worse. I told them I was planning to go back to school to finish my degree and maybe pursue something in business or finance, and that I needed the money to support myself during that transition. They all nodded and said they understood, but I could see the disappointment in their faces. They'd already started counting my money as family money in their heads. To them, my settlement wasn't Connor's fresh start. It was the family's solution to their perpetual money problems. The first real test came about 3 months after I received the settlement. Emma got evicted from her apartment for not paying rent, and my parents were panicking about where she was going to live. Vincent offered to let her stay with his family temporarily, but their house was already cramped with 2 small children. During a family dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to Emma's situation. Mom was getting emotional about her baby girl being homeless, and Dad was talking about family sticking together in tough times. Emma sat there looking sorry for herself while everyone discussed her problem like she wasn't capable of solving it herself. Finally, Mom turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Connor, you know we wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, but could you help Emma with a security deposit and first month's rent on a new place? It would only be about $3,000. I felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. Emma was looking at me with hopeful eyes, Vincent was nodding like this was obviously the right thing to do, and my parents were waiting for me to prove that I was still part of the family team. But something about the situation felt wrong. Emma hadn't apologized for getting evicted or explained what she was going to do differently to avoid it happening again. Nobody was asking what she'd learned from the experience or what her plan was for maintaining stable housing. They just wanted me to throw money at the problem and make it disappear. I told them I needed to think about it, which clearly wasn't the answer they were hoping for. The dinner ended on an awkward note, and I could feel their judgment as I left that night. I was being selfish with money that could help family. I was forgetting where I came from. I was letting success change me. But I held firm. The next day, I called Emma and told her I'd help her look for apartments and review her budget, but I wasn't going to pay her way. If she wanted family financial support, she needed to move back in with our parents temporarily and figure out a real plan for independence. She didn't take it well. She accused me of being cheap and forgetting what family means. She said I was acting like I was better than everyone else just because I had money. My parents were disappointed but tried to stay neutral. Vincent was the only one who seemed to understand my position, though he didn't say so in front of everyone else. That was the beginning of the end of my relationship with my family as I'd known it. They'd show me that they saw my settlement money as their ticket to easier lives, and I'd shown them that I wasn't going to be their financial savior. The tension was subtle at first, but it was always there, hovering under the surface of every family interaction. I should have seen what was coming next. For the next few months after the Emma situation, things stayed relatively calm on the surface. My family had backed off from direct requests for money, but I could sense their resentment simmering underneath our interactions. Family dinners became stilted affairs where everyone was polite but distant. Emma barely spoke to me, and when she did, there was an edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. I decided to go back to school to finish my business degree, and I was taking classes part-time while doing physical therapy for my back. I'd moved into a small apartment near campus, partly for convenience, but mostly to get some distance from the family tension. I was finally starting to feel like I had some control over my life and my future. The settlement money was sitting safely in my accounts, earning modest returns while I focused on my education and health. I'd calculated that if I was careful, the money could support me through school and provide a solid foundation for whatever career I chose afterward. For the first time since the accident, I felt optimistic about what lay ahead. That's when I made the mistake that would cost me everything. My parents had been talking for months about taking a family vacation. They kept saying how the accident and legal stress had been hard on everyone, and wouldn't it be nice to get away together and reconnect as a family. Vincent and Rachel were interested but worried about the cost with 2 kids. Emma was enthusiastic but obviously couldn't afford it. My parents wanted to go but were doing their usual thing of planning an expensive trip they couldn't actually pay for. During one family dinner, Mom brought up a cruise package she'd seen advertised. 2 weeks in the Caribbean, all meals included, activities for kids, the works. She had brochures spread out on the table and was talking excitedly about how perfect it would be for bringing the family together. Dad started running numbers out loud, calculating what it would cost for all of us. The total came to about $18,000 for the whole family. Vincent and Rachel exchanged worried looks. Emma just assumed someone else would figure out the money part. My parents kept talking like the cost wasn't a problem, even though I knew they didn't have anywhere near that amount available. Finally, Mom looked at me with that same hopeful expression from the Emma situation and said, "Connor, what do you think? Wouldn't this be exactly what our family needs right now?" I could see where this was heading, but I tried to deflect. I talked about how expensive it sounded and suggested maybe we could do something local instead. I mentioned that I was focused on school and couldn't really take 2 weeks off anyway. But Dad jumped in with his solution. What if Connor covered the cruise costs as an early Christmas gift for the whole family? He'd been so generous to everyone over the years, and this would be a way to give back. Besides, $18,000 was nothing compared to what I'd received in the settlement. The pressure was immediate and intense. Vincent looked uncomfortable but didn't object. Rachel was trying to stay neutral, but I could see she liked the idea of a free vacation. Emma was practically bouncing in her chair with excitement. My parents were looking at me like this was a perfectly reasonable request. I felt trapped. If I said no, I'd be the selfish family member who wouldn't share his good fortune. If I said yes, I'd be opening the door to more and more requests. But the way they were all looking at me, like this was already decided and I just needed to confirm it, made me feel like I didn't really have a choice. Against my better judgment, I agreed to pay for the cruise. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Mom started crying with joy. Dad was patting my back and talking about what a good son I was. Emma was already planning what clothes she'd need to buy for the trip, and Vincent was thanking me repeatedly while promising they'd make it up to me somehow. But even as I was agreeing to pay, something felt wrong about the whole situation. Nobody was asking if I could afford it or if it would impact my school plans. Nobody was treating it like the massive financial gift it was. They were all acting like I was finally doing what I should have been doing all along with my money. The cruise was booked for the following month, and immediately the scope started expanding. Mom decided she needed new clothes for the trip and asked if I could cover a shopping trip. Dad realized their luggage was too old and worn for such a nice vacation. Emma needed everything from swimsuits to evening wear. Vincent and Rachel started talking about excursions and specialty dining packages that weren't included in the base price. Each request was presented as a small addition to my original gift. Just a few hundred here and there to make sure everyone could fully enjoy the vacation I was providing. When I tried to push back on some of the extras, I was reminded that I'd already committed to the trip, and these were just necessary expenses to make it happen properly. By the time we actually left for the cruise, I'd spent nearly $25,000 instead of the original $18,000. But everyone was so excited and grateful that I convinced myself it was worth it to see my family happy. Maybe this would reset our relationships and we could move forward without the money tension that had been building. The cruise itself was a disaster from my perspective, though everyone else seemed to have a great time. I spent most of the trip feeling like the designated wallet rather than a family member. Every activity, every meal, every purchase became an opportunity for someone to suggest that I cover additional costs since I was already paying for everything else. Emma ordered expensive drinks constantly and charged spa treatments to the room. My parents upgraded their dining packages and booked shore excursions without asking me first. Vincent and Rachel were more reasonable, but they also started treating the trip like an all-expenses-paid vacation where money was no object. When we got back, I calculated that the total cost of the trip had ended up being close to $32,000. That was almost 10% of my entire settlement, gone in 2 weeks. But I told myself it was a one-time thing, a family bonding experience that was worth the cost. I was completely wrong. Within a month of returning from the cruise, the request started again. Mom mentioned that their credit cards were maxed out from preparing for the trip and asked if I could help them pay them down. Emma needed money for rent again because she'd spent her rent money on cruise clothes. Dad's truck needed major repairs that he couldn't afford. Each request came with references to how generous I'd been with the cruise and how much it had meant to everyone. They weren't asking for gifts anymore. They were asking me to maintain the lifestyle I'd introduced them to. Somehow, paying for one family vacation had created an expectation that I would continue subsidizing everyone's life. I started saying no again, but the response was different this time. Instead of disappointment, I was getting anger. Emma accused me of being cruel for giving them a taste of the good life and then snatching it away. My parents started making comments about how the money had changed me, how I used to care about family before I got wealthy. The breaking point came during Christmas. I'd planned to give modest but thoughtful gifts to everyone, but Emma had apparently told her friends and her new boyfriend about my settlement money. When I showed up to Christmas dinner, her boyfriend made some comment about how I must be excited to show off my generosity to the family. It became clear that Emma had been bragging about having a rich brother and possibly even promising her boyfriend that he'd benefit from my wealth somehow. The whole evening felt like a performance where I was expected to play the role of the generous, wealthy relative. After Christmas, I decided I needed to have serious conversations with my family about boundaries and expectations. I was going to explain that while I loved them, I couldn't continue being their financial solution for every problem. But before I could have those conversations, I discovered that the problem was much worse than I'd realized. I was checking my account statements in early January when I noticed some discrepancies. There were several large withdrawals that I didn't remember making, and my savings balance was significantly lower than it should have been. At first, I thought it might be bank errors or charges I'd forgotten about. But when I called the bank to investigate, I learned something that made my blood run cold. Someone had been accessing my accounts using my personal information, and the withdrawals had been going on for months. The bank's security department traced the access back to several different locations, but one pattern was clear. Most of the unauthorized activity had happened from my parents' house while I was staying there during my recovery. Someone in my family had been stealing from me, systematically draining my settlement money while pretending to respect my boundaries. The bank's investigation revealed the scope of the theft, and it was worse than I could have imagined. Over the course of 8 months, someone had stolen nearly $89,000 from my accounts through a combination of online transfers, forged checks, and unauthorized debit card usage. The transactions had been spread out and kept just under reporting thresholds, suggesting that whoever was doing this understood how to avoid detection. My stomach dropped as I reviewed the detailed report with the bank's fraud investigator. The timing of the thefts aligned perfectly with periods when I'd been staying at my parents' house during recovery, when family members had visited my apartment, or when I'd left my wallet or laptop unattended during family gatherings. Someone had been systematically collecting my personal information and using it to drain my accounts. The investigator explained that the theft showed clear signs of being an inside job. The perpetrator knew my social security number, had access to my phone for two-factor authentication codes, and understood my banking patterns well enough to time withdrawals when I was unlikely to notice immediately. This wasn't some random identity theft. This was someone who knew me intimately. I felt sick as the reality sank in. One of my family members had been robbing me blind while looking me in the eye and asking for more money. They'd stolen from me while I was recovering from injuries that had nearly killed me. They'd taken advantage of my trust during the most vulnerable period of my life. The bank assured me that I'd be able to recover most of the stolen money through their fraud protection policies, but the process would take time and require filing police reports and pressing charges. They needed me to provide information about who had access to my personal details and when the information might have been compromised. I drove home from the bank in a daze, trying to process what I'd learned. My first instinct was to call my family and confront them, but the investigator had advised me to be careful about tipping off the perpetrator before law enforcement could gather evidence. Instead, I needed to think through who had the means and opportunity to pull off this kind of systematic theft. My parents had definitely had access to my information during my recovery. I'd been on pain medication and dealing with legal paperwork, so I'd asked for help organizing documents and managing appointments. Mom had helped me set up online banking when I was having trouble typing with my injuries. Dad had run errands for me that involved accessing my wallet and cards. Vincent had also helped during my recovery, though he'd been less involved in my financial affairs. But he'd stayed at my apartment a few times to help with physical therapy appointments, and he was tech-savvy enough to pull off online banking fraud if he'd wanted to. Emma was the most obvious suspect. She'd always been irresponsible with money, she'd shown no remorse about asking me for handouts, and she definitely had opportunities to access my information during family gatherings. But the sophistication of the theft scheme seemed beyond her usual level of planning and execution. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to my family's behavior and finances. I noticed that Emma had been posting pictures on social media showing off new clothes, gadgets, and restaurant meals that should have been well beyond her budget. My parents had made several home improvements over the past few months that they'd mentioned paying for with a small windfall from some investments. Most telling was Vincent's situation. Despite claiming he was stretched thin financially, he'd recently bought a newer car and had been talking about putting his kids in private school. When I'd asked about the sudden improvement in his finances, he'd been vague about some side work that was paying well. The evidence was pointing in every direction, which made me realize that this might not be the work of just one person. What if my entire family had been working together to systematically steal from me? What if the cruise and the constant requests for money had been distractions while they robbed me behind the scenes? I decided to set a trap. I casually mentioned during a family dinner that I was thinking about liquidating some investments and moving a large sum of money into a new account. I made sure to mention the specific bank and roughly when the transfer would happen. Then I waited to see if anyone would take the bait. 3 days later, there was an attempt to access the new account I'd mentioned. The bank's security team caught it immediately since I'd warned them to monitor for suspicious activity. The attempt came from my parents' home computer, but that didn't necessarily tell me who was behind it since multiple family members used the computer. I knew I needed to involve law enforcement, but I decided to give my family one chance to come clean before I destroyed our relationships forever. I called a family meeting and told everyone I needed to discuss something important about my finances. When everyone gathered at my parents' house that Sunday, I could see the tension in the room. Vincent looked nervous, Emma was fidgeting with her phone, and my parents seemed uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. I knew in that moment that they all knew exactly why I'd called this meeting. I started by explaining that I'd discovered significant fraud on my accounts and that the bank was investigating. I said that the evidence pointed to someone with inside access to my personal information and that I was hoping whoever was responsible would come forward before I had to file police reports. The response was immediate and telling. Instead of shock or concern for my welfare, I got defensive anger. Emma immediately accused me of trying to blame the family for my own financial mismanagement. Dad said I was being paranoid and suggested that maybe I'd forgotten about withdrawals I'd made myself. Mom started crying and asking how I could think my own family would steal from me. But Vincent's reaction was different. He just sat there looking resigned, like he'd been waiting for this moment for months. When I made eye contact with him, he looked away quickly, and I knew I'd found at least part of my answer. I told them that I had until the end of the week to provide the bank with information about potential suspects, or the investigation would move forward with law enforcement involvement. I said I hoped someone would find the courage to be honest with me before that happened. As I was leaving, Vincent followed me outside. His face was pale and his hands were shaking as he asked if we could talk privately. I knew he was about to confess, but I wasn't prepared for what he told me. It hadn't been just one person stealing from me. It had been all of them, working together in a coordinated effort that had started almost immediately after I received the settlement money. Vincent had been the technical mastermind, using his access to my information to set up the online banking access. My parents had provided the physical access and opportunities to gather information. Emma had been the lookout and had helped create diversions during family gatherings when they needed to access my belongings. They convinced themselves that they weren't really stealing because I had so much money and they had so many needs. They figured I'd never miss the amounts they were taking, and they planned to pay it back someday when their situations improved. The cruise and the constant requests for money had been partly genuine and partly a way to normalize taking large amounts from me. Vincent broke down as he explained how it had started small but escalated as they got more comfortable with the process. He said they told themselves they were just borrowing money that I wouldn't have given them willingly, and that families should share resources anyway. But he admitted that it had spiraled into something much worse than anyone had intended. I asked him how much they'd taken in total, and his answer made my knees weak. Including the money I'd given them willingly for the cruise and other requests, my family had cost me over $140,000 in less than a year. That was almost half of my settlement money, gone to fund their shopping sprees, home improvements, and lifestyle upgrades. As I drove home that night, I felt a strange sense of clarity despite the betrayal. At least now I knew the truth about what my family really thought of me and my money. They didn't see me as a person deserving of respect and consideration. They saw me as a resource to be exploited for their benefit. The next morning, I called the bank and provided them with all the information I'd gathered. I told them I wanted to press charges and pursue full prosecution for the theft. I also called a lawyer to discuss my options for recovering the money and protecting myself from future fraud. But I wasn't done with my family yet. They'd stolen from me for months while pretending to love and support me. They betrayed my trust during the most difficult period of my life. They treated my generosity as weakness and my kindness as stupidity. It was time to show them the consequences of their choices, and I was going to do it in a way that would make sure they never forgot the lesson. The legal process moved faster than I expected. With Vincent's confession and the bank's evidence, law enforcement had an airtight case against my family. The district attorney was particularly interested in prosecuting because the systematic nature of the theft and the vulnerability of the victim, someone recovering from serious injuries, made it an especially egregious case. Within 2 weeks, warrants were issued for all 4 family members. Vincent, true to character, turned himself in and cooperated fully with prosecutors. My parents were arrested at their home, and Emma was picked up at her job. The local news picked up the story because of the unusual nature of a family conspiracy to defraud an accident victim, and suddenly everyone in our small town knew what my family had done to me. I felt no satisfaction watching my parents' mugshots on the evening news or reading the newspaper articles about the charges. These were people I'd loved and trusted my entire life, and they'd thrown away our relationships for money they'd never even needed. They destroyed our family for luxury cruises and home improvements and shopping sprees. The financial recovery process was complex but ultimately successful. The bank's fraud protection covered most of the stolen money, and law enforcement was able to trace and recover assets that my family had purchased with my funds. Between insurance claims, recovered assets, and restitution orders, I would eventually get back about 85% of what they'd taken. But while the legal system was handling the criminal aspects of what they'd done, I was dealing with the emotional aftermath. I'd lost my entire family in one devastating revelation. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had spent months systematically robbing me while I recovered from injuries that had nearly killed me. The worst part was the manipulation. Every family dinner where they'd acted concerned about my well-being, every conversation where they'd praised my wisdom in being careful with money, every moment of apparent family bonding, it had all been a lie designed to keep me from discovering their theft. They'd been professional-level con artists operating against their own family member. As the criminal cases moved through the courts, I started getting calls and messages from various family members and friends. Most were expressing shock and support, but some were more complicated. A few people suggested that I should consider dropping the charges because they're still your family, and everyone makes mistakes. Some thought I was being vindictive for pursuing prosecution instead of handling it privately. But the message that really got to me came from Emma about 6 months after the arrests. She'd been released on bail and was facing the possibility of several years in prison. She called me from a blocked number and left a voicemail that started with an apology but quickly turned into an attempt at emotional manipulation. She talked about how the family was falling apart, how mom was having health problems from the stress, how dad might lose his job because of the publicity. She said Vincent's kids were being teased at school and that Rachel was considering divorce because of the financial and legal mess. Emma claimed that everyone had learned their lesson and just wanted to move on with their lives. Then she got to the real point of her call. She said that some lawyers had told the family they might be able to negotiate reduced sentences if I was willing to write letters to the court asking for leniency. She wondered if we could meet to discuss how to heal the family and move forward together. I listened to that message 3 times, marveling at the audacity. Even facing criminal prosecution, Emma was still trying to manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. She was still treating me like a resource to be managed rather than a person they'd wronged. She still thought she could find the right combination of guilt and false promises to get me to bail them out one more time. That's when I decided to send them a message they'd never forget. I spent several days crafting a response that I sent to each family member through their lawyers. It wasn't long, but every word was chosen carefully. I started by acknowledging their apologies and their request for leniency letters. Then I explained that I'd spent considerable time thinking about their request and had decided to honor it in my own way. I told them I was prepared to write letters to the court, and that these letters would contain the complete truth about our family relationships and their treatment of me. I outlined exactly what those letters would include, detailed accounts of every instance where they'd made me feel guilty for not sharing my settlement money, documentation of how they'd pressured me into paying for the cruise and other expenses, specific examples of their entitlement and manipulation throughout our relationships, a thorough explanation of how their theft had impacted not just my finances but my ability to trust anyone ever again. I explained that I would tell the court about my mother helping me set up online banking while secretly gathering information to steal from me. I described my father's comments about family loyalty while he was forging my signature on fraudulent checks. I detail Vincent's technical expertise in accessing my accounts while pretending to be concerned about my financial security. I document Emma's social media posts showing off purchases made with stolen money while she asked me for rent assistance. But then I offered them an alternative. If they preferred, I would write different letters to the court. Letters that focused on accepting responsibility for their choices without trying to minimize the impact on me. Letters that acknowledged the systematic and premeditated nature of their theft. Letters that recognized the betrayal of trust they'd committed against a family member who was recovering from serious injuries. These alternative letters, I explained, would support appropriate sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes. They would emphasize that justice needed to be served, but that justice could include opportunities for rehabilitation and genuine making of amends. They would acknowledge that our family relationships had been permanently damaged, but that I hoped each of them could learn to become better people through this experience. I gave them 2 weeks to decide which type of letter they preferred I send to the court. The response was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. Vincent called within hours to say he wanted the second type of letter. He said he understood that he'd destroyed our relationship and that he deserved whatever sentence the court imposed. He asked only that I consider allowing him to write me a letter someday, not asking for forgiveness but taking full responsibility for his choices. My parents took longer to respond, but eventually they also chose the second option. Dad's lawyer called to say that my father had finally accepted that he'd committed serious crimes and was prepared to face the consequences. Mom's response came through her lawyer as well, with a message that she was getting counseling to understand how she justified stealing from her own son. Emma held out for almost the full 2 weeks before finally capitulating. Her lawyer called to say she understood that I would not be requesting leniency and that she needed to accept responsibility for her actions. I wrote thoughtful, honest letters to the court that emphasized accountability while acknowledging each person's capacity for growth and change. I didn't ask for maximum sentences, but I made clear that their crimes had been serious and premeditated, committed against a vulnerable family member who had trusted them completely. Vincent received 3 years in prison but was released after 18 months for good behavior and cooperation. My parents each received 2 years of house arrest and substantial community service. Emma got 18 months in minimum security prison followed by supervised probation. The restitution payments continue to this day, though they're small amounts that will take decades to complete. I donate most of the money to organizations that help accident victims and people dealing with family financial abuse. I finished my business degree and now work as a financial advisor, specializing in helping people protect their assets from family exploitation. It's more common than most people realize, and my own experience helps me recognize the warning signs and emotional manipulation that predators use against their own relatives. I haven't spoken to any of my family members since the sentencing hearings 4 years ago. Vincent has sent 2 letters through lawyers, taking responsibility and expressing genuine remorse, but I'm not ready for contact and may never be. Emma has attempted to reach out several times through mutual friends, but her messages still contain subtle attempts at manipulation and guilt-tripping. My parents sent a Christmas card last year with a note saying they understood if I never wanted to see them again, but that they wanted me to know they were working to become better people. I appreciated that they didn't ask for anything or try to justify their actions. People sometimes ask if I regret pressing charges or if I miss my family. The truth is complicated. I miss the people I thought they were, but I've come to understand that those people never really existed. The family members who stole from me while I recovered from life-threatening injuries were showing me their true characters, not acting out of character in a moment of weakness. The settlement money was supposed to be my safety net after a traumatic accident nearly destroyed my life. Instead, it revealed that the people I trusted most were willing to exploit my vulnerability for their own benefit. They taught me that blood relationships don't guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. But they also taught me something valuable about my own strength. I survived a devastating accident. I rebuilt my life after discovering systematic betrayal by my own family, and I created new boundaries that protect my well-being. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their choices. I'm building a life surrounded by people who value honesty, respect, and mutual support. I'm in a healthy relationship with someone who understands that trust is earned through consistent actions, not demanded because of labels or history. I have friends who celebrate my successes without trying to claim a piece of them. My family taught me that money reveals people's true characters. In their case, it revealed greed, entitlement, and a willingness to exploit vulnerability. In my case, I hope it revealed strength, boundaries, and the wisdom to choose relationships based on how people treat me rather than what they claim to feel for me. The letters I sent them said everything that needed to be said. Their silence in response told me everything I needed to know about whether they'd really learned anything from the experience. And my continued success and happiness without them is the best revenge I could have asked for.